Racist police officers arrested a black woman for no reason, purely out of prejudice, without knowing she was an undercover CIA agent, but what happened next made them beg for forgiveness. It was supposed to be just another night under the glow of downtown city lights, expensive suits, crystal glasses filled with golden liquid, laughter echoing off marble walls. A rooftop corporate party, the kind only the top 1% ever get invited to. She had the credentials, the invitation, the dress. She belonged there more than half the men making shady deals over cigars. But she wasn't there to socialize. She was on a mission. Quiet, composed, unnoticed, just like she'd been trained. Until someone decided she looked like she didn't belong. Security's been watching her, a woman in pearls whispered into her phone from behind the champagne tower, eyeing her with the same contempt she might give to a spilled glass on her white rug. She's been hovering too long. Get someone up here. It was subtle at first, the way the glances grew longer, the way the space around her seemed to shrink as conversations drifted away like mist. And then it wasn't subtle anymore. 3 officers in uniforms far too casual for the event burst through the rooftop elevator. They didn't ask questions. They didn't request ID. They grabbed her by the wrist, spun her around, and slammed her against the nearest column, shattering her wine glass into the concrete below. Everyone stopped. Music cut. Conversations died. "You're under arrest for trespassing and impersonation," one of them said, loud enough to make sure everyone heard, his voice already full of judgment. "Don't resist or it's gonna get worse. I have an invitation." "Check I said don't talk. Hands behind your back." Her voice cracked, not out of fear, but rage. "You don't even know who I am." A man in a navy suit, holding a whiskey tumbler, scoffed. "We don't care who you pretend to be." And just like that, with one violent pull, they threw her to the ground, knees scraping, palms hitting hot pavement, in front of dozens of elegantly dressed strangers now pulling out phones to film, not to help. Laughter. Confusion. Pity. Disgust. One woman clutched her pearls and muttered, "This is why these events shouldn't be open to everyone." The metal cuffs clicked like final judgment. She was walked out in shame, head held high, but eyes burning. Not a single person tried to stop it. Not one. And they had no idea what they'd just done. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She let them talk. She let them gloat in the back seat of the patrol car while one of them joked, "Probably stole that dress. Bet the shoes too." She let them run her fingerprints with arrogant smirks, waiting for something to hit the system. She watched them grow frustrated when nothing came up. No priors. No ID. Nothing. They assumed it was because she was a nobody. They were wrong. The truth was buried under 6 layers of clearance. They couldn't find her because she wasn't meant to be found. And while they processed her as another nameless black woman disrupting the peace, she remained silent, calculating, memorizing names, faces, words. Every detail. Because the moment she stepped into that rooftop, she knew she was walking into a trap. Just not this kind. What they didn't know was that this nobody they dragged away in front of the city's most powerful guests was not just someone with a badge, she was the badge behind the badge. A federal shadow placed precisely to expose systemic corruption within city law enforcement. The people who arrested her. They were already part of an ongoing investigation. They just didn't know how close the knife was to their own throats. But the damage was done. They humiliated her. Not her cover, her dignity. Her identity. Her entire existence was spit on like she was nothing. And despite every shred of training that told her to remain calm, to follow protocol, something inside her snapped that night. Because it wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about something deeper. Personal. Historic. Carved into her bones by generations who were taught to stay quiet, stay polite, stay invisible. So she didn't call the CIA immediately. She didn't expose her identity right away. Instead, she waited. Because real justice doesn't always come in silence. Sometimes it comes with volume, and witnesses. The next morning, inside a courtroom packed with reporters and officials, the arresting officers stood behind a glass pane, laughing quietly with the arrogance of men who'd done this before. She walked in, clean, composed, wearing the same dress, uncuffed, escorted by someone they knew only from television. A federal prosecutor whispered something into the judge's ear. Then everything changed. In seconds, the courtroom flipped. Their names were called. Their files were opened. And as she approached the stand, not as a suspect but as a key witness with federal credentials, the smirks melted off their faces. The judge looked at them. And then looked at her. And everything they thought they controlled collapsed right there in front of them. Because when she revealed who she really was, what her job was, what her mission had been that night, it wasn't just a twist. It was a reckoning. What they did wasn't just wrong. It was illegal. And the evidence she carried with her, audio, video, witnesses, would not only destroy their careers, it would expose a chain of corruption that stretched across the department, into the court system, and even higher. But what made them beg for forgiveness? What happened after that courtroom? After the reveal? That's where the real twist lives. Because this wasn't just about proving she was innocent. This was about proving how many times women like her had been arrested, dismissed, or destroyed without the power to fight back. This time, she had the power. And she used every inch of it. But what she did with that power, well, would you have done the same? Stay until the end. You won't believe how far she went, not for revenge, but for justice. Before we begin this story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, prejudice, and discrimination in any form. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of storytelling to bring truth to light. If you've ever been judged, overlooked, or mistreated because of the color of your skin, please know this: we see you, we support you, and your story matters. Now, get ready. Because this one's for you. Enjoy the story, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you don't miss a single twist. Atlanta pulsed beneath the dusk sky, the city's skyline glimmering with mirrored buildings and distant traffic like veins glowing in the chest of something alive. The rooftop where it would all unfold sat high above it all, just another piece of elite real estate owned by people who'd never once looked down and truly seen the city they claimed. But before that rooftop became a scene of disgrace and revelation, before cameras rolled and reputations crumbled, there was just a woman walking calmly through the city, unseen by everyone and yet observing everything. Her name was Imani Rhodes. Imani wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her presence wasn't the type that turned heads in the street, not because she blended in, but because she moved with the confidence of someone who knew silence could be louder than a scream. She was 36, tall, lean, with a skin tone rich as bronze under moonlight, and eyes so observant they made most people uncomfortable without knowing why. Born and raised in East Baltimore, the daughter of a librarian and a mechanic, Imani grew up learning how to listen, to books, to engines, and more importantly, to people. That skill became her armor, her weapon, and her career. No one from her childhood would have guessed she'd become one of the CIA's most trusted deep-cover agents. Her life was a mosaic of control and adaptation. She could blend into rooms that weren't built for her, speak languages she'd never heard as a child, and carry herself through billion-dollar conferences or barbershop corners with the same composure. Her mission wasn't just professional. It was personal. She had walked the line of invisibility her whole life, not because she wanted to, but because the world insisted she should. The agency valued her for that. She could enter places no one else could. Hear things no one else would be trusted to. Become who they needed, until the assignment was done. Her current mission brought her to Atlanta, under the alias of a tech consultant for an international investment group. The objective was complex but not unfamiliar: infiltrate a network of executives tied to a growing pattern of offshore laundering, who were allegedly protected by local law enforcement. For months, she'd maneuvered through fundraisers, charity events, and phone networking panels, always watching, always collecting, always silent. The operation had been building toward a single evening, a rooftop gala hosted by the Pinnacle Equity Group, an event as exclusive as it was corrupt. Every name on her list would be there. And so would a few names she hadn't planned on. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope, hand-delivered to the hotel suite where she was staying. She opened it with gloved fingers, already memorizing the font, the weight of the paper, and the subtle watermark in the bottom corner. That's what made Imani different. She didn't just read, she absorbed. Every detail was a breadcrumb, every texture a thread in a tapestry she was slowly unraveling. That night, she dressed with precision. Nothing flashy, nothing forgettable. A sleek navy dress, tailored to the contours of her frame, chosen to suggest elegance but practicality. Her hair was pinned with a discreet silver clasp that doubled as an audio recorder. A chain bracelet on her wrist could be tapped 3 times to trigger an emergency beacon. She applied a soft red lip, not for beauty, but because the lipstick was hollow and contained a rolled-up microtransmitter. She wasn't playing dress-up. She was preparing for war. When she entered the rooftop, it was like slipping into cold water. The air was thin with artificial laughter and perfume. Conversations floated like champagne bubbles, all surface, no depth. She scanned the room, locating exits, faces, expressions. Her cover name was Danielle Sharp, a fictional consultant whose online profile had been meticulously created 6 months earlier. No one questioned her. Not at first. She was simply another, +1, in the blur of privilege. The night moved as expected. Introductions, hollow flattery, whispered hints of future deals, and in between, the quiet transactions of secrets being sold behind handshakes and smirks. Imani floated, careful not to draw too much attention. She stood near the bar for a while, then moved closer to the eastern edge of the rooftop where she could see the whole layout. One man in particular had caught her eye, Franklin Dean, a local developer with ties to 2 suspicious offshore accounts and rumored connections to city police. She was just beginning to record when she noticed the change. A hush near the back of the rooftop. Subtle at first, just glances. Then 2 men whispering into their collars. Then the woman in pearls. That woman, Elaine Harwood, wasn't on the target list. But the expression she gave Imani, as if a rodent had wandered into her parlor, made her stand out more than anyone else. Elaine didn't approach. She simply turned and disappeared behind a catering curtain, pulling out her phone. Moments later, the elevator opened, and 3 officers stepped out. They weren't dressed for the event. That much was clear. And they weren't looking for someone. They already knew who. Imani had felt many things in her life, danger, suspicion, doubt. But this was different. This was familiar. This was the same feeling she'd felt when she was 15 and stopped in a store for holding a purse, too confidently. The same look in a teacher's eye when asking her, "Do you really belong in this honors class?" It wasn't about what she had done. It was about what she looked like. She could have stopped it. She could have shown them her badge, revealed her authority, ended the misunderstanding. But she didn't. Because it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a performance. And sometimes, the only way to expose a performance, is to let the curtain fall. The officers grabbed her arm. One twisted it behind her back without warning. A collective silence fell over the crowd, like a record had skipped at the worst possible moment. A man nearby muttered something about security risk. Someone else laughed nervously. She could feel her knees press against the stone tiles as she was forced down, her bracelet tapping against the ground, triggering the recording. Her dress tore slightly at the hem. She kept her eyes open the entire time, burning every face into memory. They spoke to her like she was trash. One officer even smiled when she winced. And the worst part? No one helped. Not the people she had laughed with earlier. Not the woman who offered her a canopy. Not the bartender who joked with her over drink choices. They turned their heads. Pretended to be confused. Pretended not to see. The drive to the precinct was quiet. Imani said nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't demand anything. She simply watched. The officer in the passenger seat pulled up her fake profile on his phone and said, "Let's see how your story holds up under pressure, Danielle." The walls of the precinct were yellowed with age. The paperwork was slow. They joked in front of her. Treated her like entertainment. One officer asked if she had kids. Another said she looked too good for jail and laughed. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. Because what they didn't realize, what they would only learn too late, was that the moment they laid hands on her, the mission changed. It wasn't about exposing a network anymore. It was about exposing them. And she would do it the same way they did to her, publicly, mercilessly, and with full authority. But for now, she waited. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never saw coming. The holding cell smelled like bleach and regret. The flickering light overhead buzzed with that low electrical hum that made the silence feel louder. Imani sat on the metal bench, wrists resting on her knees, her posture still as steel. She didn't look afraid, not even uneasy, just quiet, waiting, breathing slowly like someone counting down seconds they already owned. The officer who processed her, Sergeant Wade, stood just outside the cell, arms crossed, looking at her like she was some puzzle that didn't quite fit. "You've been real quiet," he said, his tone somewhere between smugness and suspicion. "Most people cry or scream by now. You. Nothing. You must think you're special." She didn't respond. Not because she had nothing to say, but because nothing he said deserved a reply. He waited a beat, maybe expecting her to break, to flinch. When she didn't, he muttered, "Yeah, didn't think so," and walked away. The hours dragged, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. In the corner of the precinct's back office, two other officers whispered over a computer screen. Officer Langley, the youngest of the three who'd arrested her, tapped the keyboard impatiently, searching through databases with growing frustration. "She's not coming up anywhere. No priors. No license. No state ID. Nothing. It's like she doesn't exist," he said. "That's not possible," Officer Morales replied, his brow furrowed. "We got her name from her purse, didn't we?" Langley clicked again, squinting at the monitor. No purse was logged. "You sure she had one?" Morales paused. "I thought she did." Their confusion deepened. Imani, from her cell, could see the tension tightening in their movements. The illusion of control, so secure hours ago, was beginning to crack. Elsewhere in the city, another phone vibrated. In a nondescript apartment 2 blocks from the state capitol, a man in a dark blue suit with graying temples picked up on the first ring. "She's in," said a voice on the other end. "No blowback." "Not yet. They don't know who she is." The man nodded slowly, staring out his window as the city lights flickered in the glass. "Let them hang themselves. We move at dawn." Then he hung up. Back at the precinct, the night shift settled in. The overhead TVs buzzed quietly with muted sports highlights while paper coffee cups stacked in corners. Officer Langley, still visibly frustrated, approached the holding cell. "All right, look. This is weird, okay? We tried to run your name. Nothing came up. But you were at that event, and your name was on the guest list. So, what's your game?" Imani tilted her head slightly. "You're asking the wrong questions," she said. Langley leaned in, gripping the bars. "No, I think I'm asking exactly the right ones. What were you doing at a private event like that? Who were you really watching?" Her eyes didn't move. "If I were you, I'd be more concerned about who's been watching you. Langley froze. Morales called from across the room, Langley. Something's wrong with the server, it's like her prints triggered a red wall. Says restricted access. We need admin clearance just to get more info. Langley swore under his breath. That can't be right. She's a nobody. But his voice cracked on the last word, like even he didn't believe it anymore. He turned back to Imani, who now stood slowly, her full height imposing behind the bars. Let me go, she said calmly, and maybe no one has to get hurt. Professionally, I mean. But they didn't. They couldn't. They were too far in now, too proud, too stupid. Sergeant Wade returned, saw the tension, and laughed dismissively. You boys getting scared of a woman with no ID? She's bluffing. He unlocked the cell and stepped in, looming over her. I don't know who you think you are, but I'm gonna make sure you remember who we are. Imani didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just whispered, you're going to regret that. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with unusual activity. An unmarked black car pulled up just after dawn. A tall woman in a charcoal suit stepped out, flashing her federal badge to the receptionist without a word. Behind her, 2 more agents followed, carrying sealed files and a portable server. They walked straight to the captain's office. Within minutes, voices rose. Papers slammed. The blinds were drawn closed. Every officer on duty paused as a cold weight settled in the air, something had shifted. Imani, still in holding, heard the footsteps before anyone else. Clean, deliberate. Authority wrapped in silence. Langley appeared at the door moments later, paler than he'd been all night. Get up, he said quietly. She raised an eyebrow. Finally. They led her down the hallway, not in cuffs this time. Morales tried to make eye contact, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of fear. Wade wasn't in sight. Inside the office, the federal agent stared hard at the precinct staff. The lead woman flipped open a file, revealing a printed photo, the same rooftop event. Circles drawn around several faces. Do you recognize any of these individuals? She asked the captain. He nodded slowly. Yeah. That's the Harwood lady. Big donor. And Franklin Dean. That guy's dirty, we've suspected that for months. The agent looked unimpressed. Your department received 3 official memos from Homeland Security last year about unauthorized protection of known corporate suspects. We have reason to believe your precinct has been compromised. The room went silent. Imani stood by the doorway, watching. Observing. Listening. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a slow implosion. The agents revealed more files, names, transcripts, phone logs. The event on the rooftop had been a trigger, not a coincidence. And the officers who arrested Imani weren't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were part of something larger. Something that, up until now, had gone unnoticed because the people victimized by it didn't have the power to fight back. Imani did. Outside, the city was waking up. News vans gathered at the edge of the street, tipped off by an anonymous message. Someone inside the precinct had leaked the arrest. The footage from the rooftop had gone viral overnight, not just the arrest, but the silence. The looks. The smugness. The brutality hidden behind white shirts and authority. Inside the interview room, Sergeant Wade sat alone. His jaw clenched, his hands twitching. The agent sat across from him, stone-faced. You don't understand, he muttered. She didn't look like she belonged. That place wasn't for people like her. The agent leaned forward. She belonged more than anyone else in that building. She dropped a photograph on the table. Imani, in uniform, standing beside the CIA director. Wade blinked. What is this? The agent didn't answer. She didn't need to. Back in the hallway, Langley approached Imani with careful steps. Look. I didn't know. I didn't mean for it to go like that. I was just following. Imani cut him off. You weren't following orders. You were following bias. Don't confuse the two. His mouth opened, then closed. He stepped back. Imani left the precinct not with anger, but with resolve. She didn't need revenge. She needed exposure. She needed accountability. And as the agents escorted her into the black car, as cameras flashed and questions were shouted, she looked ahead without blinking. She had let herself be humiliated, on purpose. She had let them fall into the trap, willingly. Now, the trap was closing. But what happened once the door shut behind her? What did she do with all that power, with all that evidence, and all that pain? What came next would not only change the careers of a few dirty cops, it would shake the entire system that protected them. And no one, not the officers, not the guests on that rooftop, not even the agency she worked for, was prepared for the move she was about to make. The conference room inside the federal courthouse was quiet, too quiet for a space that held the weight of what was about to unfold. Fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sterile glow across the long table where files, audio recorders, and sealed evidence folders waited like dormant weapons. Imani stood at the end of the room, her back straight, palms flat on the smooth surface in front of her, eyes locked on the thick double doors. She wasn't dressed like an agent anymore. No tactical gear, no wire, no alias. Just a simple black suit, no jewelry, no makeup. It was intentional. She didn't want anything to distract from what she was about to say. What she was about to do. Behind those doors, seated in a holding area not yet aware of what was waiting for them, were Sergeants Wade and Morales, along with Officer Langley. They had been brought in under the pretense of a clarification meeting with Internal Affairs. They didn't know the courtroom was already filled with federal agents, journalists, a select group of city officials, and 3 people who had once trusted them to protect their communities. One of those people was the mayor. The doors opened. Langley was the first to step through, followed by Morales, looking uncertain, and Wade, arrogant as ever. Their eyes swept across the room, and then landed on Imani. Confusion flickered first. Then disbelief. Then something deeper, a recognition that arrived too late to save them. Wade's smirk faded. What is this? Imani didn't answer right away. She stepped aside, revealing the screens behind her. One click on the remote, and the screen lit up with footage, the rooftop arrest, from a wide angle. No editing. No voiceover. Just reality. The roughness of Wade's grip. The way Langley avoided her eyes. The silence of the crowd. The click of cuffs. The power imbalance in full display. There were no special effects. No dramatic music. Just the unfiltered truth. Langley's voice cracked. This was recorded. Imani finally spoke. From 4 different angles. With full audio. Morales shifted uncomfortably. Wade took a step forward. This is entrapment. Imani turned toward him, her voice level but sharp. No, this is accountability. You weren't trapped. You were given a choice. You made it. Repeatedly. An older man stepped forward from the gallery. His badge identified him as a federal prosecutor. He placed a thick file on the table. This room is under federal review. Every conversation you had that night, every comment you made in the precinct, every keystroke, was documented. Wade shook his head, still trying to keep control. This doesn't prove anything. She was at an event she didn't belong in. Imani walked closer, the space between them shrinking into a confrontation he couldn't escape. And you thought that justified what you did? You never asked who I was. You never checked my ID. You didn't even give me the basic respect of a question. Langley's shoulders slumped, his voice a whisper. I didn't know. Imani turned to him, her tone changing, not softer, but weighted with something heavier. That's the problem. You never bothered to know. You saw my skin, my silence, my confidence, and assumed threat. You weren't scared of me. You were scared of what I represented. Someone you couldn't control. The courtroom remained silent. Even the cameras in the back, filming for a confidential hearing, seemed to draw in closer. The prosecutor continued. Along with her arrest, we have evidence tying all 3 officers to previous misconduct complaints. Suppressed reports. Altered paperwork. Inappropriate use of force. You're not here to explain yourselves. You're here to answer. Morales opened his mouth, but couldn't find the words. Wade's jaw clenched as he looked around, realizing the room was no longer on his side. Then Imani stepped back and clicked to the next file, a set of voice recordings. Conversations from inside the precinct. Laughter. Jokes about race. Dismissive tones. The casual cruelty of people who believed they were untouchable. Each voice matched to each officer in the room. The faces around the gallery shifted from shock to disgust. You were never just arresting me, Imani said, her voice cracking only slightly now. You were reinforcing a system you thought would protect you forever. You didn't expect someone like me to be able to fight back. Langley tried again, desperate. If we'd known who you were, she cut him off. Would you have treated me differently if I had power? That's not justice. That's fear. That's cowardice. Then came the final piece. A folder handed to the prosecutor containing a signed affidavit from a whistleblower, another officer, one who had watched the arrest from a distance and stayed silent, until now. The affidavit detailed how these same 3 men had coordinated a cover-up involving evidence in a case tied to Franklin Dean, the very man Imani had been sent to expose. The same man they were supposed to be watching. Not protecting. The prosecutor didn't need to say anything else. The pieces connected themselves. Imani stood in the center of the storm she had engineered with surgical precision. Not out of vengeance, though she would have been justified. But for justice. For every woman who'd been silenced. Every black man thrown to the ground for walking in the wrong place. Every child taught that their skin was a threat before they could even speak for themselves. The judge entered the room, and the formal proceedings began. But for Imani, it was already over. The point had been made. The system had been forced to look at itself, not as a mirror, but as a spotlight. As the officers were escorted out, now in cuffs themselves, Imani didn't watch them go. She looked at the reporters, the officials, the city's decision-makers. And she made sure they saw her, not as a headline, not as a viral clip, but as a woman who had taken back control of the narrative that others tried to steal. But the moment wasn't complete. Not yet. Because what Imani did next, outside of the courtroom, in a press conference that would go on to shake institutions, wasn't about punishment. It was about something far more radical. She was going to change the law. And no one, not the agency, not the city, not the officers who had underestimated her, was prepared for what she had planned. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown beyond what anyone expected. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes like steel flowers blooming toward the gray sky. Reporters paced in tight circles, mic cords tangled around their feet, eyes darting from the doors to their producers to the pulsing red lights on their cameras. The wind pushed murmurs through the gathered public, and among them stood people who didn't usually come together, mothers, students, off-duty workers, elders with protest signs faded from marches that had come and gone. They weren't just there for a story. They were there because they had seen the video, heard the audio, read the names. And for once, they had a face to put with the fight. Imani stood just beyond the glass doors, staring at the ripple of people through the window. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her. Her heart wasn't racing, it was steady, deliberate. She had waited for this. The press coordinator, a tall woman with tight curls and a calm intensity, approached her. "They're ready," she said softly. "You still want to go on live?" Imani nodded once. Yes. But I'm not answering questions. I'm telling the truth. That's it. The coordinator gave a tight smile. You're not just telling it, Imani. You're changing it. The podium was placed on the courthouse steps. The city seal stood behind her, flanked by 2 flags, one national, one state. As Imani stepped up, the flash of cameras ignited like lightning, and a hush rippled through the crowd. She took a breath. Not to calm herself, but to feel the moment. She didn't read from a script. She didn't use a teleprompter. Her voice was clear, measured, every word intentional. I'm not here today because of what happened to me on a rooftop. I'm here because of what that moment revealed. I was arrested, not for a crime, but for existing in a space that people didn't believe I deserved to occupy. No warning. No verification. No basic human respect. Just judgment, force, and humiliation. And that's not just my story. That's a story Black people in this country have been forced to survive for generations. She paused. No one moved. No one blinked. But I had something most don't. I had access. I had training. I had people behind me. And even with all of that, I was still treated like I was disposable. What does that say about what's happening to those who don't have a badge in their pocket, or a network watching their back? What happens to the ones who disappear quietly? She reached into the folder beside her, pulling out a single document, a proposed legislative bill. This is the Transparency and Enforcement Accountability Reform Act, the TR Act. It mandates federal oversight into local law enforcement when misconduct complaints are systematically ignored. It funds body cam technology that can't be disabled by individual officers. It demands racial bias training developed by people of color, not just those pretending to understand our lives. And it creates a national misconduct registry, so no officer can simply resign and move to another town to start again. Her voice tightened now, not from nerves, but from the weight of holding back years of emotion. This isn't just punishment. This is prevention. This is power being returned to the people it was stolen from. You don't get to keep hurting us and calling it protocol. You don't get to silence us and call it order. If we must carry the burden of being seen as a threat, then we will become one, to the systems that built themselves on our suffering. Somewhere in the crowd, someone clapped. Then more. Then it became a wave. Not the kind born of performance, but the kind that rises when truth finally meets daylight. After the statement, Imani stepped down, declining every question. She didn't need to say more. Her words had already been carried beyond the steps, across live streams, through car radios, onto social feeds. But what came next wasn't about public reaction, it was about the personal. Later that evening, Imani returned to a small, private room inside a government building. She was to meet with the interim police commissioner, a woman named Joanne Merritt, appointed after the previous chief stepped down during the fallout. Commissioner Merritt was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, with a posture built from years of surviving male-dominated spaces. She looked at Imani not as an opponent, but as a mirror of what strength looked like when channeled right. I read every line of that bill, Merritt said, motioning for Imani to sit. I support it. But passing it won't be easy. The unions are already pushing back. Imani sat calmly, folding her hands in her lap. They'll push back until it costs them more to ignore us than to change. Merritt leaned forward. I want to clean this house, Rhodes. But I'll need you in the room. Not just as a symbol, but as an architect. Imani met her gaze. I didn't come this far to give speeches and disappear. There was a knock at the door. A staffer leaned in, eyes hesitant. One of the officers. Langley, he's requested to see her. Alone. He says he has something to say. The air in the room shifted. Imani didn't answer right away. She looked at Merritt, then stood. Give me 10 minutes. She entered the adjacent room. Langley was seated, no cuffs this time, but his posture was deflated. A man unraveling from the inside. He looked up when she walked in, his voice shaking. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to tell you something." She remained standing, silent. "I watched that footage last night. Over and over. I kept thinking, how easy it was. How fast I went along with it. I didn't even question Wade. I didn't ask if you had ID, if you were invited. I just assumed. And I keep hearing myself laughing in the precinct. Like it was just another day. But it wasn't. I helped humiliate someone who was doing her job, who was risking her life while I was playing power games I didn't even understand." His voice cracked. He stood slowly, his eyes wet but steady. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. I see it now. And I'll never unsee it. You changed how I look at everything. I don't expect a second chance. But I swear, if I ever wear that badge again, it'll be different." Imani looked at him for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply nodded. "You should have seen it then," she said quietly. "But it matters that you see it now." He nodded, ashamed. She turned to leave, then stopped. "Don't let this be about guilt. Let it be about change." As she stepped into the hallway again, she felt it, not closure, not entirely, but something that mattered more. A shift. A weight lifted not because justice had been fully served, but because the silence had finally broken. And as she walked away from that building, the night air wrapped around her, quiet and cold, she knew the war wasn't over. But the tide had turned. What was once humiliation had become history in the making. And this time, it was being written by her hands. The days that followed unfolded like a tremor beneath the surface of the city, subtle but relentless, shaking foundations that had stood unchallenged for decades. News cycles cycled through the arrest, the courtroom reveal, the press conference, and now, the consequences. But for Imani, it wasn't about headlines or attention. It was about what lingered after the noise died down, what remained when the cameras turned off and the world moved on to the next scandal. She had pierced a system built on silence, but dismantling it, piece by deliberate piece, was far more complicated than exposing it. Her role was shifting from agent to advocate, from undercover to out front, and every step into the light came with a cost she had never trained for. The first consequence was political. City Hall called for an emergency session within 48 hours of the press conference. Council members who had previously kept their distance were suddenly eager to be seen as allies, their public statements filled with carefully worded condemnations of systemic failures and the need for reform. Behind closed doors, however, many of them panicked. The TR Act represented a threat not just to corrupt officers but to the quiet relationships of protection and favor that had existed between politics and policing for years. Lobbyists arrived. Phone calls were made. Backroom meetings exploded into arguments. Some council members tried to delay the vote, citing legal technicalities. Others wanted amendments, weakening the bill's core to render it symbolic rather than structural. Imani sat through every session, unblinking, her presence a constant reminder that the public was now watching. Outside the chamber, protesters filled the streets. Not just chanting, but educating, sharing statistics, stories, and resources. A mural of Imani appeared on the side of a downtown building, painted in bold strokes with the words, "We're not invisible anymore," stenciled beneath it. It was surreal to her, to see her face become a symbol, but she accepted it not as celebration, but responsibility. With each passing day, she received more messages, some of gratitude, some of pain, some filled with questions she had no answers for. Survivors of brutality, mothers of the incarcerated, young activists seeking guidance, officers in secret who confessed to watching the system rot from the inside. The movement was growing, but so was the resistance. One afternoon, she was called into a private meeting with Commissioner Merritt again. The woman's face was more lined than before, her eyes weary from fighting a battle on two fronts, reforming a broken department while fending off political sabotage. She offered Imani a file, thick and sealed, labeled only with a number. We ran the names from your investigation. Dean wasn't just laundering money. He was paying for silence. Officers. Politicians. Even a judge. Some of the people still on the bench today helped suppress evidence in exchange for campaign donations. We've started the indictments quietly, but it's a wildfire waiting to spread. Imani opened the file, scanning the names. Some she recognized. Some stunned her. She looked up. What happens when the public finds out, she asked. Merritt sighed. That's the dilemma. Do we rip the system open, all at once, and risk collapse? Or do we pull it apart slowly, strategically, and risk the public thinking nothing's being done? Either way, it's messy. Imani tapped the edge of the file. There's no clean justice. We've been cleaning up their mess for too long. Let it burn. The commissioner gave a grim nod. Then be ready. When this fire starts, everyone close to it gets scorched. The next consequence came in the form of Langley. Despite the charges dropped against him due to a cooperation deal, he became a target, not of Imani, but of the officers he used to call brothers. He showed up at a community meeting bruised, wearing sunglasses indoors. Whispers floated through the crowd that he'd been jumped by former colleagues. He approached Imani after the meeting ended, hesitantly, a man still carrying shame like armor. They're not going to stop, he said quietly. Not the ones who got away. They think this is temporary. That once the cameras go, so do the consequences. Imani studied his face. And what do you think? He swallowed. I think they're wrong. But I don't know how to prove it. She reached into her bag and handed him a binder, training materials, legal statutes, procedural reforms. Then start here. Teach. Speak. Get others to listen. This isn't about redemption. It's about transformation. But only if you mean it. Langley took it with a quiet nod, the weight of a second chance settling into his hands. Meanwhile, the city buzzed with change. The TR Act passed in a heated vote, one that ended with a single deciding ballot cast by a young councilwoman who had watched her brother be incarcerated under falsified charges years ago. The passage didn't solve everything, but it opened the door. Federal oversight began trickling into departments previously untouched. Internal affairs was no longer toothless. Cameras stayed on. Complaints were investigated instead of buried. It wasn't fast. It wasn't complete. But it was undeniable. Yet amid all the momentum, Imani faced the final and most personal dilemma, whether to return to the agency or remain where the fire was hottest. Her superior, Agent Walker, flew in for a closed-door conversation. He found her sitting at a small cafe downtown, sipping black coffee, her eyes scanning a nearby headline about the reform bill. You've made quite a name for yourself, he said as he sat down. We're impressed. And concerned. She raised an eyebrow. Concerned? You broke protocol. Went public. Stirred a political hornet's nest. I exposed a rot you've been sending agents to investigate for years. What's the problem? The problem is we're not in the business of making enemies. You're too visible now. And we don't control visibility. Imani leaned forward, her voice low and sharp. Maybe that's the problem. You trained me to disappear. To listen, infiltrate, adapt. But this time, I didn't need to disappear. I needed to be seen. Walker paused, then sighed. So what now? You staying? Imani looked out the window, watching as two teenagers chalked messages of justice on the sidewalk outside the courthouse. I'm not going back, she said. There's more work here. Real work. I don't want to be a ghost anymore. Walker nodded once. He stood, hesitated, then placed a small envelope on the table. In case you ever change your mind. Or need backup. She didn't touch it. The sun was starting to set as she walked home through the city. The buildings glowed amber, windows catching light like mirrors. People nodded to her now, not with awe, but with recognition. She had become part of something larger, something that was no longer about one rooftop arrest, but about the fractures underneath a whole system. The change was uncomfortable. It was painful. It was uneven. But it was happening. And as the day faded into night, Imani felt it, not peace, not victory, but the slow pull of resolve hardening into something permanent. Something unshakable. The weight of injustice hadn't disappeared. But now, finally, it had met its match. The air inside the community center that evening was thick with anticipation. Folded chairs creaked beneath anxious bodies, the walls humming low with whispered conversations and the scent of burnt coffee. The space wasn't glamorous, a worn linoleum floor, fluorescent lights that buzzed louder than the murmur of the crowd, a podium that leaned slightly to the left, but tonight it felt like the most important place in the city. Imani stood in a back corner, unnoticed for a moment, watching as families settled in, as teenagers dragged their chairs next to elders who held their words like they held their breath. This was what change looked like before the camera crews arrived, raw, uncertain, and still deeply wounded. At the front of the room, Commissioner Merritt adjusted the mic, clearing her throat as silence gradually fell. Her voice was steady, even as her eyes revealed the exhaustion behind every recent decision. She began by thanking the crowd for coming, acknowledging how this wasn't just another town hall, how trust had to be rebuilt with hands and truth, not press releases. Then she motioned gently toward Imani, who slowly made her way to the front, the room turning toward her as if pulled by gravity. She stood at the microphone, her reflection faint in the dusty glass of the window behind her, and for a moment, she didn't speak. She just looked at them, every face, every pair of eyes that held some version of her story. When she did speak, her voice was low but firm, thick with a calm rage. You've seen the videos. You've read the headlines. You've watched the apologies. But none of that matters unless we decide together what comes next. Because what happened to me isn't new. What happened to me happens in different ways every day, quieter, slower, without a camera. This fight didn't start with me, and it won't end with me. A woman in the second row raised her hand, her voice trembling as she asked, "But how do we stop it? I've watched my son get stopped 5 times this year just walking to work. I'm tired of being scared when I see a patrol car. What are we supposed to do when the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones hurting us?" Imani stepped closer, nodding slowly. We hold them accountable. We use laws, cameras, protests, but we also use each other. Community isn't just a word. It's a shield. They expect us to act alone. That's how they keep control. But when we come together like this, we're the ones in control. Another voice rose, younger this time. A teenage boy in a hoodie leaned forward, his voice sharper. What if it never changes? What if we do all this and they just find new ways to keep hurting us? Imani met his eyes. Then we change the rules. We run for office. We become the lawyers, the judges, the mayors, the journalists. We don't ask for space, we take it. And we never stop demanding better. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The room fell quiet again, but not with silence, with understanding. It wasn't closure. It wasn't comfort. It was recognition. A moment of shared pain shaped into purpose. Later that night, after the crowd had trickled out, leaving behind half-empty water bottles and the echo of possibility, Imani sat across from Commissioner Merritt in a small office at the back of the building. They sipped tea in chipped mugs, their bodies slouched from the weight of the weeks behind them. You ever wonder if it's too much? Merritt asked, her voice low, almost confessional. If the system's too broken to fix? I have files on officers with a dozen complaints who are still on payroll. There are judges protecting the same men who were supposed to be fired. Even with this reform, it feels like we're digging with spoons in a mountain. Imani stared at the swirling steam rising from her mug. Yeah, I wonder. But I also think about every name I never knew, the people who fought before us and never got this far. And I think maybe this isn't about fixing everything. Maybe it's about fighting so someone else doesn't have to start from scratch. Merritt looked at her then, eyes damp with something unspoken. You make it sound so clear. It's not, Imani said. But it's worth it. The next morning, a letter arrived at Imani's apartment, hand-delivered and unsigned. It was written in block letters, simple and direct. We see what you're doing. Be careful how far you go. No threats. No signature. Just a warning soaked in cowardice. She read it twice, then folded it and placed it on the counter. This wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. Threats came easy to people afraid of change. Still, it was enough for her to reconsider her schedule for the day. She cancelled a meeting, rescheduled a panel. Instead, she walked through neighborhoods untouched by press cameras, past playgrounds where laughter had long ago faded, past buildings that bore the weight of their history in broken windows and hand-painted murals. At one corner, she stopped at a school. Through the fence, children were running in circles, their voices chaotic and free. She smiled. As she turned to leave, a boy maybe 9 or 10 ran up to the fence, gripping the bars. Are you that lady from TV? He asked, wide-eyed. Imani chuckled softly. I guess I am. He looked at her like he was seeing a superhero. My mom says you made the police scared. Imani knelt down slightly, so they were eye to eye. No, I made them seen. Scared is just what happens when the truth comes out. The boy grinned, showing a missing tooth. I'm gonna be a lawyer. You should, she said. We need good ones. He nodded and ran back to the playground. She watched him go, her chest tightening with something bittersweet. The work was long, the progress slow. But that moment, that tiny seed planted, was proof of impact. Back at her apartment, Imani stood by the window as evening fell again. The skyline blinked quietly in the distance. Her phone buzzed, another request to speak on a panel, another interview. She placed the phone down. Then she turned toward her dining table, now covered in folders, notes, draft legislation, community requests. Her new mission wasn't about infiltration anymore. It was about amplification. And every story she carried now, hers, and those entrusted to her, deserved to be fought for out loud. She thought about the ones who wouldn't get to stand behind microphones, the ones still caught in cycles of silence and fear. She thought about the officers who were never held accountable, and the families still waiting for answers. She thought about how easily things could slip back into the shadows if people stopped paying attention. But they were paying attention now. And as long as they did, as long as she remained visible, relentless, and grounded, the balance would keep shifting. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a process. And Imani was far from finished. That weekend, the city hosted its first Community Justice Summit, a gathering that hadn't existed before the arrest, before the video, before Imani's name had echoed through the streets and into the national conversation. It wasn't held in a corporate ballroom or a marble civic center, it was inside the gymnasium of an old high school that had been closed for years and only recently reopened as a community space. The paint still peeled from the rafters, the wooden bleachers creaked with every shift of weight, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that people came, not just to listen, but to speak, to argue, to grieve, to demand. The walls echoed with voices that had long been silenced by intimidation or indifference. Mothers clutching photographs. Youth leaders clutching clipboards. Teachers. Ex-officers. Volunteers. Ministers. Teenagers. All of them with stories, and all of them with that same determined fire in their eyes. Imani arrived through the back, unnoticed at first. She didn't wear anything to draw attention. She had stopped trying to fit anyone's image of what a leader should look like. Her power now came from authenticity, not approval. She stood off to the side as the first panels began, absorbing the hum of raw truth that pulsed through the room. Then her name was called. She walked up to the stage, nodding toward Commissioner Merritt seated in the front row, and took the mic without fanfare. The room hushed again, not with obligation, but anticipation. She began not with a speech, but with a question. What happens when you win, but the system still breathes? The silence that followed was thick. She continued, her voice even. We exposed corruption. We passed a bill. We put men in jail. And still, my inbox is full of new complaints. Still, young men are being profiled. Still, officers are gaming the system. So what happens when the victory is not the end, but the beginning of something harder? A man in the crowd, tall and broad-shouldered, stood and raised his hand. His voice cracked when he spoke. I did 18 months for something I didn't do. My case never made headlines. I got out, and no one said sorry. No one gave me back the time I lost. So what do I do with that? Imani nodded slowly. You use your voice. You mentor. You organize. You testify. I can't give you back those months. But I can make sure your experience stops being invisible. When you speak, they can't look away. Another voice rose from the bleachers, younger, sharper, filled with urgency. A girl no older than 17 stood with her fists clenched by her sides. You talk about laws and change, but what about now? What about walking home from school and praying a cop doesn't look at me the wrong way? What about the fear that's still here? Imani looked directly at her. You're right to be afraid. And you're even more right to be angry. But you have something they can't take, community. Every time we gather like this, every time we name the problem out loud, we strip away the lie that this is normal. Keep organizing. Keep documenting. Keep showing up. Fear fades when it's shared. And change gets louder when it's collective. As the summit continued, Imani sat on 3 panels, joined breakout circles, and listened, really listened, to voices that didn't always agree with her. Some challenged her. Some called her out. Some asked hard questions. Why didn't the bill do more? Why did some officers get plea deals? Why were some names still protected while others suffered publicly? And she didn't shy away. She answered with honesty, not excuses. That night, as the event wrapped and the gym began to empty, Commissioner Merritt found Imani standing near the back wall, her coat folded over her arm, her face drawn not with exhaustion but with reflection. You were good today, Merritt said, her voice low. Imani looked at her. I wasn't trying to be good. I was trying to be honest. Merritt nodded. That's rarer than people think. They walked out together, their steps echoing against the pavement. As they approached the commissioner's car, Merritt paused, her hand on the door handle. You ever think about taking it further? Politics, I mean. People trust you now. They'd follow you. Imani shook her head slowly. Trust is sacred. I don't want to turn it into strategy. Not yet. There's too much work outside the office. Merritt smiled faintly. Just don't wait too long. Systems change fastest from the inside. Imani watched her drive off, the taillights fading into the night. She stood still for a while, beneath a flickering street lamp, thinking not about herself, but about all the faces she'd seen that day. Then her phone buzzed. A message from Langley. Can we talk? She hesitated, then typed back, where? He suggested a neutral cafe near the edge of town. She arrived first, choosing a booth near the back, her seat facing the entrance. When Langley arrived, he looked different, thinner, quieter, as if the weight of the past weeks had eroded something from him. He sat down slowly, avoiding her eyes at first. "I've been working with a few groups," he said, voice low. "Youth justice programs. I even spoke at a training. Told them what not to do. What I did. It wasn't easy." Imani sipped her tea, waiting. "I'm not here to make myself feel better," he said quickly. "I'm not looking for redemption. But I heard something that stuck with me. One of the kids, he asked me if I ever thought about the people I could have helped, if I hadn't followed the wrong orders." He finally looked at her, eyes raw. "I didn't have an answer. But I wanted to ask you, do you believe people can actually change? Or is this just damage control?" Imani leaned forward, her voice softer now. "I believe people can change. But only if they live in the truth long enough to let it hurt. Most don't. Most run back to comfort. But if you stay in the fire, if you keep listening, keep showing up, keep admitting the worst parts of yourself, then yeah. You can change." Langley nodded slowly. "Then I'll keep burning." He stood to leave, but before he could walk away, Imani said quietly, "Don't do it for me. Do it for the kid who asked you that question." That night, Imani returned home to find another envelope slipped under her door. No threat this time. Just a handwritten note, "Thank you for making them listen." Signed, someone who couldn't speak before. She folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer with a growing collection of similar notes, pieces of quiet solidarity that reminded her of why she kept going. The next morning, she opened her laptop to news of another protest in a different city. A familiar cycle, a wrongful stop, an unarmed boy, a video spreading like wildfire. Her heart clenched, not with surprise, but with clarity. This wasn't over. Not even close. But now, more people were watching. More people were speaking. And she wasn't alone. Imani stood at the window, looking out as the sun began to rise over the buildings, bathing the city in gold and shadow. Somewhere out there, another version of her was waking up. Someone who hadn't yet found their voice. Someone about to be tested. Someone who would need to know they weren't invisible. She would be ready for them. Imani stood on the steps of the Capitol Annex building, the early morning sun casting long golden shadows behind her as reporters waited with notepads ready and microphones lifted like weapons of truth. What had begun as a single act of humiliation had cascaded into something much greater than punishment. It had become policy, practice, permanent change. The final version of the TR Act had not only passed, but was being modeled by other states. Cities that had refused accountability were now under federal review. Complaints no longer vanished in silence. Officers now operated under real scrutiny. But Imani had already stepped past the bill. Her role had evolved. After months of community-led summits, strategic partnerships, and transparent advisory work, she had accepted a new position, Director of Civilian Oversight, a state-level appointment with actual teeth. It wasn't a title she ever craved, but it was a seat at a table that needed her voice. Her job now wasn't to chase justice for one case. It was to ensure systems never got the chance to repeat the same pattern. Her office was nothing grand, a small space in a historic downtown building, still furnished with the basic essentials, but it had windows that opened wide, and walls now covered in maps, timelines, and post-its from every town she'd visited across the state. Each note carried names of people who had spoken their truth. Some were no longer alive. Some were still fighting. She never forgot a single one. Every morning she read 3 of those names aloud before starting her day. Not as a ritual. As a reminder. Langley, surprisingly to many, had found redemption not in apology but in action. He resigned from the force, relocated to a city nearby, and joined a nonprofit that trained young men of color in legal literacy and community rights. He worked without titles, without applause, showing up at court dates, mediating tense traffic stops as an observer, building credibility slowly. A year after the scandal, he wrote an op-ed under a pseudonym, not about himself, but about accountability. He never once mentioned Imani's name. She read it anyway and recognized the growth in every sentence. He never tried to contact her again. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. Commissioner Merritt stayed in her role longer than planned. Though her original intent was to retire once the dust settled, she found herself too invested in the transformation to walk away. With Imani's counsel, she dismantled internal practices that had protected misconduct, expanded recruitment to ensure real diversity, and created a civilian complaint unit composed entirely of people from neighborhoods previously neglected. Her name became synonymous with reform, though she rarely sought attention. Her proudest moment came months later, during a city council meeting when a young activist stood up and said, "This city feels different now, not perfect, but no longer invisible." Merritt quietly smiled, knowing that was the only recognition she needed. Wade and Morales faced trial, but their outcomes diverged. Morales, shaken and remorseful, accepted a plea deal and agreed to testify against larger corruption rings in exchange for leniency. He entered witness protection shortly after, realizing that survival now meant vanishing. Wade, on the other hand, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. His courtroom testimony was defiant, filled with entitlement and denial. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced not just for excessive force, but for obstruction and civil rights violations. The day he was led away in cuffs, the media fixated on his expression, not rage, but disbelief, as if the system he had served so blindly had turned on him without warning. But in truth, the system had never protected him, it had only tolerated him, until it couldn't. Elaine Harwood, the socialite who sparked the arrest with a single phone call, vanished from public life. Her foundation lost sponsors, her name removed from gala invitations. No formal charges were brought against her, but the court of public opinion didn't need a trial to deliver judgment. She issued a written apology through a PR firm months later, but no one cared. The world had already moved on without her. As for Imani, the final moment of her arc wasn't defined by applause or televised ceremonies. It was quiet. One afternoon, in a modest bookstore downtown, she sat across from a group of teenagers, answering questions about how she stayed calm, how she kept going, how she made people listen. A girl asked her, voice cracking slightly, "Do you ever feel afraid, even now?" Imani smiled, not dismissing the weight of the question. "Every day," she said. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's knowing what you stand for even when fear tries to silence you. After the session, the same girl left a note on Imani's chair. It read, "Because of you, I believe I can fight back. Not with anger, with knowledge." That note now sat pinned above Imani's desk, beside her federal ID badge, which she had framed and retired. Not because she was done serving, but because she was finally serving on her own terms. So what does justice really look like? It doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes, it looks like slow reform, hard conversations, restructured systems, quiet shifts in power. Sometimes it's a new law. Sometimes it's an old institution finally crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. But most of the time, justice looks like the people who refuse to be silent, who turn pain into purpose, who challenge not just what happened to them, but the conditions that allowed it to happen in the first place. Imani didn't ask for this path. But she walked it with integrity, rage, clarity, and grace. Her story wasn't one of revenge. It was one of reclamation. And her legacy would not be written by the people who tried to humiliate her, but by the communities that rose because of her resistance. Now, to everyone listening, how many times have you witnessed injustice and stayed silent? How many times have you seen someone suffer and convinced yourself it wasn't your fight? What would you do if it were you, or someone you loved, on the receiving end of silence dressed as order? Because here's the truth, silence protects power. But voice, when united, creates change. So speak up. Stand firm. And never let anyone decide your worth based on their own prejudice. If this story moved you, if it challenged the way you see the world, then share it. Start a conversation. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What part hit you the hardest? What would you have done in Imani's place? And if you want more stories that twist, reveal, and inspire, stories that show just how powerful one voice can be, then don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit that like button. We're just getting started.